There is a corridor of water on this earth so narrow, so consequential, so freighted with the destiny of modern civilization that when something goes wrong there, genuinely, structurally, irreversibly wrong, you do not merely feel it at the gas pump or in the quarterly earnings reports of shipping conglomerates. You feel it in the bones of the international order itself. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its tightest point. 21 miles. A motivated swimmer, in theory, could cross it. And yet, through that sliver of blue between the Iranian coast and the rocky shores of Oman, flows roughly 1/5 of all the oil and liquefied natural gas on the surface of this planet. It is the jugular vein of the global economy, and on the morning of April 14, 2026, a single Chinese tanker named the Rich Starry sailed through it, flagrantly, deliberately, and without consequence. And the world will not be the same for it. Let us begin, as all serious analyses must, with what actually happened, because the facts here are extraordinary enough without embellishment. Brent crude oil, which had opened the year at a relatively modest $61 per barrel, had by the end of the first quarter of 2026 rocketed to $118, the largest inflation-adjusted quarterly price surge since records began in 1988, according to the United States Energy Information Administration. WTI crude, the North American benchmark, sat near $93 a barrel this very morning, April 15, 2026. Brent hovered around $96. These are not abstractions. These numbers mean that every time an American family fills their tank, every time a Pakistani factory runs its generators, every time a European airline boards its passengers, they are paying tribute to a geopolitical catastrophe that began on February 28, 2026, when war erupted between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz effectively became a weapon. For weeks, the Iranian government had done something rather audacious. It had transformed one of the world's most essential international waterways into a toll booth. Vessels wishing to pass required Tehran's permission. Ships that did not comply were threatened, tracked, harassed by Iranian fast attack craft. The global shipping community, rational actors that they are, largely complied or simply stopped. Some 800 vessels, 400 of them oil and gas tankers, sat idle, anchored in a great floating parking lot of geopolitical paralysis. The disruption was catastrophic. Saudi Arabia's energy infrastructure had been damaged by attacks. OPEC Plus output had fallen by 7.9 million barrels per day in March. The International Energy Agency warned that global oil demand growth for the year could be wiped out entirely, the first annual decline since the pandemic. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the strait's closure deeply damaging. The President of the European Commission called it greatly damaging. The word damaging appeared so frequently in official communiques that one began to wonder whether diplomats had exhausted the rest of the English language. President Donald Trump, characteristically, chose confrontation over euphemism. On April 12, 2026, following the spectacular collapse of ceasefire talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, where Vice President J.D. Vance had flown with considerable fanfare and departed with considerably less, Trump announced that the United States Navy would impose its own blockade of Iranian ports and coastal waters. The blockade, he declared, would begin at 10 in the morning Eastern Time on Monday, April 13th. He invoked the same system, his words, that the United States uses against drug-running boats in the Caribbean. Iran, in Trump's framing, was essentially a cartel with a navy and a nuclear ambition, and America would treat it accordingly. The announcement sent oil prices on a vertiginous ride, swinging between fear and cautious optimism as traders attempted to price in the unknowable. What happens when the world's preeminent naval power declares sovereignty over a waterway that international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, explicitly designates as a strait open to transit passage for all nations? That question, as abstract as it might sound in a seminar room, became devastatingly concrete in the pre-dawn darkness of April 14th. At approximately 4:47 in the morning, local time, the Rich Starry began its approach. 616 feet of steel, carrying approximately 250,000 barrels of methanol, loaded at Hamria Port in the United Arab Emirates, a free trade zone that has long served as a discreet corridor for Gulf commerce, and crewed entirely by Chinese nationals. The vessel was flagged in Malawi, a flag of convenience registration so thin as to be nearly transparent. Lloyd's List, the venerable Maritime Intelligence Authority, had already noted that the Rich Starry was spoofing its automatic identification system tracking data, a trick common to what maritime security professionals call the ghost fleet. those shadowy tankers that operate outside the conventional insurance and tracking systems that give the rest of global shipping its paper trail. Its beneficial owner was Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Company Limited, a firm placed on the United States Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctions list in 2023, specifically for transporting Iranian petroleum in violation of American sanctions. And now here it was, AIS transponder broadcasting its identity with perfect openness, sailing straight toward the USS Michael Murphy and the most consequential 21 miles on Earth. This is the moment that should make every serious student of geopolitics sit very still and think very carefully. Because what happened next was not a battle. It was not an interception. It was not a confrontation. It was a conversation, a radio query, a response, and then silence. The Rich Starry told the U.S. Navy it had come from the UAE. It told them its cargo was methanol. It told them it had not called at any Iranian port in the previous 72 hours. And it was, under the precise and carefully lawyered language of U.S. Central Command's Blockade Directive, correct. The blockade applied to vessels entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas. The Rich Starry had done neither. A sanctioned ship, owned by a sanctioned company, crewed by Chinese nationals, carrying what Lloyd's List's analysis strongly suggested may have involved Iranian cargo based on its AIS spoofing history, and it sailed through, because the letter of the American blockade had a gap wide enough for a medium-range tanker to navigate. Stay with me here, because the next part of this story is where it gets deeply, uncomfortably important, and I promise you, if you think you understand what's coming, you do not yet. Because this is not simply a story about a ship. It is a story about who runs the world, and whether the answer to that question is changing. If you have been watching this channel, you know that I do not deal in hyperbole. What I deal in is history, and history has a way of announcing itself quietly before it announces itself loudly. The shot at Sarajevo was heard by almost no one. The seizure of the Sudetenland was, to many, a local affair. The closure of the Suez Canal in 1956 seemed, initially, like a regional dispute between a mercurial Egyptian colonel and two exhausted European empires. History tends to dress its turning points in the mundane clothes of current events, and only later do we recognize them for what they were. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz on April 14, 2026, belongs in that category. And if you want to understand why, you need to stop thinking about the Rich Starry as a tanker and start thinking about it as a message, because that is precisely what it was. Let us be precise about the context, because precision matters enormously here. The United States has maintained preeminent naval power in the Persian Gulf and its approaches since the Carter Doctrine of 1980, when President Jimmy Carter declared, with language unusual in its directness for a man not given to directness, that any attempt by outside forces to seize control of the Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on vital American interests and would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. For 46 years, that doctrine has been the foundation upon which the global oil trade rests. It is why Japanese automobiles can be assembled from Gulf crude. It is why European heating systems run through winter. It is why the global economy, for better or worse, has the shape it has. American naval power in the Gulf has not been a favor. It has been a structural fact of the international order, enforced by the presence of the U.S. Fifth Fleet and underpinned by a constellation of bases, agreements, and understandings that extend from Bahrain to Al Dhafra in the UAE. China has understood this arrangement with crystalline clarity. China relies on the Strait of Hormuz for roughly 40% of its oil imports. 40%. When Tehran began extorting shipping companies earlier this year, China's vulnerability was immediate and severe. The Chinese government had watched, not entirely without satisfaction, as American and Iranian tensions escalated, but the actual closure of the strait had begun to hurt Beijing in ways that could not be managed by diplomatic statements. And yet China was not a party to the conflict. China had called the U.S. blockade dangerous. China had issued no formal acknowledgement of coordinating with Iranian authorities over passage corridors. China, officially, was doing nothing but watching, which is precisely what made the Rich Starry so elegant as an instrument of statecraft. Consider what Beijing chose to send through the strait on the very first full day of the American blockade. Not a warship, not a diplomatic envoy, not a protest note to the UN Security Council. A merchant tanker. A sanctioned merchant tanker, owned by a punished company, crewed by ordinary mariners, carrying a cargo of methanol that may or may not have originated in Iranian petrochemical supply chains. It was, as a provocation, perfectly calibrated. If the United States boarded it, Beijing could scream about freedom of navigation, Chinese national safety, and the illegality of the blockade under international law. If the United States let it pass, which is exactly what happened, Beijing could let the transit speak for itself. No statement required. The silence was the statement. Here is what we know from the shipping data, the intelligence community assessments, and the reporting of Reuters, the Associated Press, Lloyd's List, and Newsweek. The Rich Starry did not stumble accidentally into the Strait of Hormuz. It had initially approached the strait on April 13th and then pulled back, hovering in international waters. It loitered. It waited. And then, at 4:47 the following morning, it moved. Multiple intelligence sources, speaking to major wire services, confirmed that the vessel coordinated its passage with Iranian authorities, following a route that aligned with what Tehran had previously described as a safe corridor through the strait, though neither China nor Iran made any official acknowledgement of that coordination. The AIS spoofing that Lloyd's List documented, suggesting the vessel may have loaded Iranian cargo, went unaddressed by U.S. Central Command's carefully worded response, which mentioned no ship by name and claimed no violation had occurred. The diplomatic implications radiated outward with remarkable speed. Within hours of the Rich Starry clearing the strait and entering the Gulf of Oman, a second sanctioned tanker was approaching the same route. The U.S. Fifth Fleet's Blockade, announced with considerable bravado 2 days earlier, had its logic challenged not by a missile, not by a warship, but by a medium-range chemical tanker and the careful exploitation of a legal definition. The UAE, America's partner, host of American troops at Al Dhafra Air Base, found itself in a position of acute diplomatic discomfort. Hamria Port, on its soil, had served as the staging point. Washington would now need to pressure Abu Dhabi to close that corridor, which risks straining one of its most important Gulf relationships, or accept that its sanctions enforcement had been comprehensively outmaneuvered. These are not pleasant choices. These are the wages of a blockade declared before the enforcement mechanism was fully designed. Now, I want to speak directly to you for a moment, because this story matters beyond the geopolitics. It matters to how you understand your own world. The war that began on February 28th has already sent Brent crude from $61 at the start of the year to over $100 at its peak, and it sits near $96 even now as talk of fresh negotiations filters through the diplomatic wires. The EIA documented that U.S. retail gasoline hit nearly $4 per gallon by the end of March, and diesel, the lifeblood of trucking and commerce, surpassed $5.40. These numbers are not background noise. They are the sound of a conflict reshaping the economic landscape of daily life for ordinary people from Karachi to Kansas City. Every tanker that passes or fails to pass through those 21 miles has consequences that show up in grocery store prices, in shipping costs, in the inflation that erodes savings and salaries alike. If you think this is someone else's crisis, trust me, it is not. And here's what worries me most, as someone who has spent considerable time studying how great powers have historically navigated moments of transition. What the Rich Starry revealed is not a loophole that can be quietly closed. What it revealed is a structural tension at the heart of American sanctions policy that has been building for years, and that the Strait of Hormuz crisis has simply made visible. The Ghost Fleet, those hundreds of sanctioned tankers operating under false flags, spoofed transponders, and shell company ownership structures, has been moving Iranian, Russian, and Venezuelan oil around American sanctions for years. The Rich Starry was not an improvisation. It was the product of an elaborate infrastructure of evasion that China, Iran, and Russia have been constructing methodically, precisely because they anticipated a moment like this one. The question is not whether that infrastructure exists. The question is whether the United States has the tools, the will, and the diplomatic bandwidth to dismantle it, especially when doing so risks direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed great power that is China's economy's largest trading partner. I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to walk you through in the final part of this story is something no mainstream outlet has fully assembled yet. The endgame scenarios, what they mean for the global order, and why the decision made in the next 72 hours in Washington and Beijing will echo for decades. This channel exists to give you the analysis that cuts through the noise. Do not miss what comes next. History, Winston Churchill once observed, is just one damned thing after another. But occasionally, rarely in fact, one of those damn things arrives that is not merely another episode in the endless chronicle of human ambition and miscalculation, but a genuine inflection point, a moment after which the landscape of possibility looks different than it did before. The transit of the Rich Starry through the Strait of Hormuz on April 14, 2026, may well be one of those moments. Not because a tanker passed through a strait, tankers have been passing through straits since the Phoenicians invented maritime trade, but because of what it demonstrated about the current state of American power and the architecture of the international order. Let us be honest about what U.S. Central Command's statement actually said in the hours following the Rich Starry's transit. It said that U.S. naval forces continue to enforce the blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas. It said that vessels entering or leaving Iranian waters without authorization would be subject to interception. It said nothing. Pointedly, deliberately, legally, carefully said nothing about the Rich Starry. A sanctioned vessel, owned by a sanctioned company, almost certainly carrying cargo connected to the Iranian petrochemical supply chain, based on Lloyd's List's AIS analysis, had sailed through the most scrutinized waterway on Earth during the opening hours of a declared American blockade, and the official response was a statement that conspicuously omitted its name. That is not enforcement. That is, to employ a term from naval history, striking the colors without acknowledging the battle. Now, the administration would push back on that characterization, and it is worth steel-manning their position. The blockade was specifically designed to avoid a direct confrontation with China. U.S. Central Command's clarification that the blockade covers vessels entering or departing Iranian ports, not all traffic through the strait, was a deliberate act of legal precision, not an oversight. The administration knew that defining the blockade too broadly would immediately collide with Chinese interests, given that 40% of China's oil transits that waterway. A confrontation with China over a tanker carrying methanol from the UAE is not a confrontation that any rational American strategist wants. The Rich Starry was allowed to pass, one could argue, because the consequences of not allowing it to pass were worse. There is strategic logic in that position. Strategy frequently consists of choosing the least bad option. But here is the problem with that logic, and it is a problem that grows more acute with every hour. The signal sent by allowing the transit was received, loudly and clearly, by every operator in the global ghost fleet. By Tuesday, according to BBC Verify's analysis of ship tracking data, at least 4 Iran-linked and 3 sanctioned vessels had been tracked transiting the strait since the blockade entered effect. The precedent was being monetized in real time. Iran's state media had already run headlines describing the Rich Starry's passage as a defeat for what they called American arrogance. Tehran was celebrating not because it had fired a missile or launched a military maneuver, but because a Chinese tanker had exposed the gap between the declaration of American will and the capacity to enforce it. And here is where the economics become inseparable from the geopolitics in ways that demand your attention. The U.S. sanctions regime against Iran has cost Tehran approximately $150 million per day under the new blockade, according to analyses cited by The National. During the 40 days of war prior to the blockade, Iran had earned roughly $9 billion from crude exports, the vast majority of which moved through precisely the kind of sanctioned shipping networks that the Rich Starry represents. That is an astonishing figure. $9 billion extracted from the global economy during a shooting war, funneled through ghost fleets, shell companies, and flag of convenience registrations. Saudi Arabia, for its part, had been urging the United States to lift the blockade and return to diplomacy, its own oil production having been cut by around 600,000 barrels per day following attacks on its energy facilities and its critical east-west pipeline damaged. The region's energy architecture, in other words, was already fractured before the U.S. blockade added another layer of complexity. Here is what the Rich Starry revealed about the nature of sanctions in the 21st century. They are only as strong as the consensus behind them. American sanctions against Iran have functioned, imperfectly but meaningfully, as long as the cost of violating them outweighed the benefit. The moment a major power, a nuclear-armed, economically vast, strategically sophisticated major power, decides that the benefit of defying those sanctions outweighs the cost, the entire edifice develops cracks. China's decision to sail the Rich Starry through the strait openly, with its AIS broadcasting, was a demonstration that Beijing has calculated the cost-benefit ratio and reached a conclusion. The ship was not hiding. Hiding would have been a concession that the sanctions had legitimacy worth evading. Sailing openly was a declaration that they do not. The diplomatic geography here is equally treacherous. The UAE, which hosts American military forces and has been a cornerstone of Gulf stability for decades, now finds itself at the center of a sanctions evasion network it did not publicly construct, but whose infrastructure runs through its free trade zones. Hamria Port is not some obscure backwater. It is a sophisticated commercial facility that has long been used for what one might politely call triangular trade. Goods and commodities that enter as one thing and leave as another, their origins conveniently obscured. Washington cannot simultaneously demand UAE cooperation on Iran sanctions and maintain the Gulf Security Partnership that makes UAE cooperation valuable. These are tensions that the Rich Starry's voyage has now forced into the open. French President Emmanuel Macron announced he is working with the United Kingdom on forming a coalition of nations willing to peacefully restore freedom of navigation in the Strait, a coalition explicitly distinct from the American-led belligerents. Saudi Arabia has urged the U.S. to lift the blockade. The IEA has warned of the first annual decline in global oil demand since the pandemic. And in Washington, officials are debating whether to tighten the blockade's rules of engagement, to define any ship owned by a sanctioned entity as a legitimate interdiction target, regardless of its last port of call. That would close the loophole. It would also, by definition, mean the United States Navy intercepting vessels owned by Chinese companies, which means the United States Navy potentially pointing weapons at ships crewed by Chinese nationals. The crew of the Rich Starry, ordinary merchant mariners doing a job in conditions of considerable fear, one reportedly asked his captain whether the U.S. Navy would open fire, would become, in that scenario, the human face of a great power confrontation. This is the trajectory that the next 72 hours will determine. The White House has indicated that a second round of negotiations with Iran may resume in Pakistan. Tehran is reportedly considering a temporary halt to shipments through the strait to facilitate diplomatic progress. WTI crude fell nearly 8% on Tuesday on those signs of potential de-escalation, and the market's hunger for a deal is palpable. But de-escalation, if it comes, will not undo what the Rich Starry demonstrated. The ghost fleet exists. The evasion infrastructure exists. China's willingness to use it as a geopolitical instrument has now been demonstrated in the most public, unambiguous fashion imaginable. Whatever deal eventually emerges from the ruins of the Islamabad talks, it will be negotiated in a world where that demonstration has been made. George Kennan, the great American diplomat and strategist, wrote that the West's challenge in the long rivalry with Soviet power was not to win a final victory, but to demonstrate over time that its model of organizing human affairs was superior. The challenge in the Strait of Hormuz today is not so different. American power in the Gulf has rested for 4.5 decades, not merely on carriers and destroyers, but on the credibility of American will, on the belief, shared by allies and adversaries alike, that Washington's declarations would be enforced. The Rich Starry sailed through the gap between declaration and enforcement. That gap, now visible to every maritime operator, every sanctioned company, every government that has ever calculated the risk of defying American power, is the real story of April 14, 2026. The tanker was just the messenger. What gives you reason for comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think, so drop your answer below, is this. When a single ship can change the calculus of the entire global sanctions regime simply by sailing through the right waterway at the right time, what does that tell us about the future of American-led international order? Is this a recoverable moment? Or is it the beginning of something that cannot be put back? The question is not rhetorical. History will answer it. The question is whether we are paying enough attention to recognize the answer when it arrives. And remember, this is for education and discussion only, not personal financial advice. I'm sharing a way to think through the history, the market, and the ownership questions so you can make your own decisions with your own money and your own risk in mind.